So there was something that cursed me in my entire life. Anytime I was in a performance or a game or a spot where I had to make it happen, at some point in that time, I was always going to fail or choke. The most famous one was the day before the state championship in high school. I shot my career best 78 in a golf tournament. Well, in a practice round for the golf tournament. And then the next day, I shot a 95, which is 17 shots worse in golf is essentially the difference between like top 10% or top maybe 5% for high school golfers at the time to below 50%. So you go from something that would actually contribute to the team and make a big difference to something that is completely irrelevant. And this type of pattern followed me throughout my career, onto YouTube, into my competitive esports career and content creation on that front, and into essentially anywhere in life that revolved around flow states, getting into the zone. I would notice like when I'm playing well, at some point that thought would hit me like, oh my word, this is the best I've ever done. And at some point in the middle of that performance, I would begin to realize how well it's going. And the moment that I realized how well it was going, things went horribly wrong. I had to think about the right wording for that. But it was a legitimate problem across every domain. And think about how weird that is. I mean, you can perform really, really well at your best in a flow state. And then at some point, kind of without your consciousness, it almost automatically begins to notice and measure how well it's going. I mean, in if you're playing a video game, for example, let's say you're playing Call of Duty and you're on like a 7 or 8 kill streak, and then suddenly you notice, oh my word, I'm on a 8 kill streak. Suddenly the heart rate increases, things feel different in that moment, and then suddenly it feels like you're struggling for all of those final kills. And the same thing can happen while playing music, while in a creative flow state, while writing, while performing on stage, while playing sports, any sport at all. And that's really, really weird. Why does noticing how well it's going ruin how well it's going? That it's something that's so normal and obvious to us that it seems like we've never sat down and really asked, why does that happen? That's really weird. We all know what a flow state is. We all know what being in the zone feels like. We all know what performing at our best without really feeling like we are in that flow state feels like. And we all know what it feels like to lose that sense of flow and then for everything to become really, really difficult. And that was just the question I kept coming back to was, why in the world does this happen? And I entirely ignored the question for a long time. So even though I felt it constantly, something in my eye, absolutely constantly, I did the same thing. I didn't take the time to think about it. I didn't think I could understand why or come up with an idea for why or whatever that would look like. So I didn't even bother. I didn't even sit there to think that it's kind of weird that no one has an explanation for that because it feels strange. And so there's clearly some sort of mode where we can get into these flow states, these moments of our highest performance that feels like faster, easier thinking, something that comes naturally to you. And then there's the grind where it's like writing the paper when you have to, when you don't want to, when it's due tomorrow and you're like, oh, and you have no idea what you're going to write, or, doing math or things along those lines, work that you don't want to do, thinking that does not want to happen. And there's some sort of linearity to it. It doesn't feel natural. It never just appears. The ideas don't just manifest on that side. They're a grind. It's one word at a time. It's what can connect this thing to that thing. There's no flow at all. So there's clearly two different things going on here. And lo and behold, what I came to find out over these last few years, and as many of you probably already know, in cognitive science, there's a lot of research on dual process theory, which is the difference between system 1 and system 2. And Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for a lot of this type of work. And system 1 is the fast thinking, the instinctual thinking, the flow state thinking. System 2 is the linear thinking, the classical one-way thinking that don't interact. They don't work in the same way. And so this has been understood for, 10, 20 years now in cognitive science. But what's strange is that neuroscience and biology haven't found or haven't connected these to what they actually are. Like, okay, sure, we have some sort of fast mode and some sort of slow mode, but what are those? And then when you layer on the performance paradox, this idea that when you notice how well you're doing, you stop performing well, that becomes a really strange scenario. And so this is what all happened with this book. And over time, how this all developed was something hit me in that regard. And I was like, wait a second. If our self-observation can collapse or change how well we're performing, then is it possible that the self-observation is itself the biomechanical switch between fast thinking and slow thinking? Could it be the ego, the sense of self, the self-referential thinking that actually itself is the switch? And that is the path we started going down. And so when you dive into it, you have to ask, well, how could that be possible? And the first thought that came to mind, the connection that really sparked all of this and went down the same rabbit hole was there's something in quantum physics called the observer's paradox, which is when you shoot a photon at the wall, it explores all paths and it goes through two slits at the same time. And in classical physics, that shouldn't be possible. It shouldn't be possible for one particle to go through two separate slits in the wall. But it does, because it's acting like a wave, not a particle. And so you have to ask, well, what in the world is going on there? So in the physics side of things search all paths. This is called Feynman's path integral. It searches all paths and then chooses the path of least action, which is accounting for interference and basically finding the fastest way to get somewhere with the least effort. And that's why when you put a fork into water, the fork looks like it's bent. Light is bending through water because it changes the path of least resistance to reach your eye. And that makes it appear curved to us. And so all of that to say, this only happens when you observe the particle. When you observe the particle, it collapses it from all possibilities down to one. And I was like, wait a second. Could this be analogous? Could there be something here? And that was when I started wondering, like, well, is there quantum processes in the brain? Could there be? And lo and behold, when you start to look at it over the last literally 2.5 years, there have been massive breakthroughs on this front when it comes to evidence for quantum processes in biological systems, especially in the brain. While obviously it's hard to directly measure quantum in the brain because of the interference itself, I mean, the measurement problem occurs everywhere, especially in the brain, because you can't just rip open a brain and shoot a microscope at, neuron cells and then not bother them while you're doing so. So you have to infer. And that's where we're at right now. But the evidence in the last 2 or 3 years has completely shifted the landscape of what people thought was possible. And this has not been talked about enough yet because quantum computing and AI have taken up basically all of the news over the last few years. But the difference here is that people in the quantum computing world think that they need to take quantum computers and put them in the brain. Quantum computers normally work by cooling systems down to absolute zero. And then because the temperature is so cold and it's so quiet and there's no interference, these waves or these particles, these qubits, can hold their superposition between 1 and 0 for a long time. And relative, of course. And that enables for algorithmic searching with the qubits. Anyway, they try to take those same ideas and be like, well, the brain clearly isn't near absolute zero, therefore there's no quantum. But that's entirely the wrong way to look at it. And this is something that's just coming out in the last 2 or 3 years, is that actually it's because the brain is an open system. It's an energy system. It requires power. It requires constant energy. If we don't have energy, we die. Okay? That's pretty straightforward. and the key here is that, well, you can actually maintain quantum states if the underlying structure supports it and if there's enough energy pumping to maintain the coherent quantum states in the brain for a short period of time. As long as there's energy pumping, it seems like that's possible. And so if you dive into the research, there's a lot of really, really good research. Babcock et al., Donati et al., Jack Tazinski, obviously my collaborator, in all of his work that he's done with Cavaglia and Nishiyama and Travis Craddock, and obviously all of the OR research as well, which includes a wide variety of work on microtubules inside of the cytoskeleton in cells. And I'll link some of the things down below if you want to go look at them. But anyway, the long story short here is that there is legitimate evidence that makes it plausible and, in my opinion, highly possible that there's quantum processes going on in the brain. Therefore, you have to ask, well, okay, that's probably what the fast thinking is, if you have to assume. Because fast thinking, what we know about system one is that it's parallel. It searches a bunch of options at once, just like a GPU does in a computer. A GPU searches a bunch of options and then finds solutions for all those options by searching in parallel. CPUs do the opposite. CPUs search very quickly, but linear. They do algorithmic searching. And so you need both in a computer because both of them serve different functions. Well, so then the question is, well, could the same thing have happened in biology? Could evolution have selected for a fast side and a slow side because they both serve different purposes and are extremely valuable to survival, especially if you can switch between the fast and the slow pretty effectively and pretty quickly? And that's what this book really dives into. And that's where I think we're at right now in this video. And that's what gets really exciting. So what does our brain have to do normally? It has to somehow search the entire space that we're in and go from everything that's going on right now to finding the right words, the right ideas, the right things to focus on to communicate ideas. So like right now, I could be focusing on any amount of things in this room, the color on the wall, the smell of the carpet, the reflection in the mirror, the spinning of the fan above me, the lighting in this room, the sounds outside, the color of the sky out the window, how the noise is reflecting off the window, the sound of a helicopter right now going by. It could be infinite. The lawnmower, like it could be infinite amount of things I could focus on. So why aren't I focusing on those things? From a purely biological standpoint, it's not obvious why I wouldn't focus on those things. Somehow over years and years and years and years of selection, our DNA, our brains have been constructed in such a way that have been selected for in such a way that focusing on certain survival relevant things seems to have benefited us, and it has resulted in the normal way in which the average human operates today. And that enables communication and focusing on ideas and language and everything else. So then you have to ask, okay, well, that's interesting. So then why would potentially this hypothesis that the ego, the sense of self, the I, the self-referential thinking, be the switch between these two? So that was the initial hypothesis. And then I was like, well, it would make sense that that based off of just these principles, if there's a quantum side and there's a classical side of the brain, parts of the brain, then, and based off what we know about physics, that interference causes collapse, that something along the lines of, I have to look at this measurement device, like in the double slit experiment, like at some point my eye has to intake the information that the particle collapsed and hit the wall, hit the sensor. At some point I have to understand that or learn that, which means that at some point some photon has to bounce off of that thing and end up in my eyeball, or someone has to tell me through my ears. There has to be some sort of exchange of information in some sense that enables the brain to translate that into meaning, so I can understand that, oh, there is a particle that was detected by a sensor that went through, and over time these particles were going through both slits at the same time. So somehow I have to, construct all of that from this information that's exchanging with my eyeballs, for example, which means that particles have to collide. They have to hit each other. And so my thought process was, okay, that's some sort of interference. And if light and if photons take the path of least resistance, then interference matters a lot in what's getting selected. And so there's some sort of connection between interference, interaction, and changing states, going from quantum to not quantum. And so that was basically the core hypothesis, was that somehow the ego generates a bunch of noise in the brain that causes interference with quantum states. And then from that, it switches from quantum to classical. And that was the original idea kind of that guided this whole exploration. And then from there, you have to wonder, like, well, okay, how plausible is this? And then lo and behold, you have to ask, well, what is the ego? What is the self-referential thinking? And in neuroscience, that's the default mode network. The default mode network is a network in the brain that is responsible for the sense of I, the sense of self, the sense of who I am as a coherent person, and how I, this thing, relate to everything around me that my brain's perceiving. Obviously, we're limited because at the end of the day, inside of our heads has to reconstruct what the outside world looks like. Of course, this is actually a philosophical claim, but let's just assume that's the case, that our brains, input information, and then from there, inside of our heads, we're reconstructing what the outside world actually looks like. And we can verify that by talking to other humans who are doing the exact same thing and saying, do you see that same thing I see? And then you can describe it through shared language. And so over time, we verify that the physical world, oh yeah, okay, there is actually a physical world out there. It's not just a reconstruction in my head, right? And so in the same way, the ego is responsible for the narrative construction. Well, I'm not just looking at this circle with a light next to it on top of this box. Like, I'm looking at a camera on top of a monitor, which is connected to a computer, which means something to me, which means I can do things with it. I know what I can do to this camera. I can talk to this camera, and at some point this video might be seen by other people. And I know that the audio, this little thing in front of me, is picking up my audio and translating it into something that will be connected to the thing that's getting captured by that video. And so there's all this meaning structure attached to my relationship to the items around me, to the environment around me. And that's what the default mode network, its goal, its main objective is, in some sense, is to maintain a coherent sense of self, as well as the relationship between me and everything else. The ego is a differentiator. It differentiates between hot and cold, between me and you, between microphone and camera, between left monitor and right monitor, bright room and dark room, all of these things. And that the ego is responsible for all of this going on at the same time. So think about how many processes we're discussing right now are happening at once. It's insane how much is happening at once. But all of that to say is, okay, then my next hypothesis was, well, that must take a lot of energy, because that is not a simple process. There's a lot going on there. And then lo and behold, when you go look into it, this is the Carhart-Harris paper, the entropic brain hypothesis, and a lot of the work that he's done and his groups have done is showing that the default mode network actually operates at 40% above baseline for the brain. And think about that. The brain itself is only like what, 2 or 3% of the body's mass. It's a very small percentage of our entire body weight, but it uses 20% of our body's energy. So it's out using its mass by an unbelievable amount. And then the ego, the default mode network, is using 40% above the baseline. So there is a massive amount of energy concentration in the egoic regions of the brain, the default mode network regions of the brain. And so inherently, what does that mean then? That means that when you are considering yourself, thinking about yourself, what it means for you, how important this is, you are measuring the value of something. For example, your performance. I'm on a 3-hole par streak right now. I'm on pace for the best round of my life. I'm currently on pace for 48 points in this pickup game. I'm on a 9-kill streak in Call of Duty. I insert, your measurement here. This is good, this is bad, this is on pace, this is not on pace. I'm behind, I'm ahead, I'm above, I'm below. They're better than me, they're worse than me. All of this stuff is a measurement, judgment about some sort of current thing happening. And your ego believes that this matters. Of course, that's up for debate. We can talk about that later in maybe another video. But now the question becomes like, okay, so your ego is doing a bunch of this measurement. And so clearly that must have to have some energetic costs. Or what happens when you stop some of that? So that's where Carhart-Harris's paper is so epic, because it's studying psychedelics and what they do to the ego and the default mode network and these areas of the brain when you're on psychedelics. And lo and behold, what it does is it actually redistributes the energy. There's not as much energy going to your default mode network and to your ego. And so what happens over time is there's not enough energy spent to separate ideas. So now suddenly ideas begin to overlap. And so this is what, in theory, what hallucinogens do and why you hallucinate in general. Because what is the difference between two things arbitrarily? And the classic example used in a lot of the research is witch and women, because, again, this has no statement on, I said this last video, this has no statement on women, I promise, but it can sound bad. But that's only because a certain percentage of the statement about witch is bad, but inherently that does not need to be the case. But in mythology, for example, or in fantasy novels or whatever, like the old lady next door who makes stew at night and eats her porridge in the morning. I mean, that's kind of archetypally like a witch. I mean, a witch in the old woman next door have a lot overlapping. They're both, biologically sexed females. They both cook things with stew. They're both elderly. They both have gray hair. They both talk in this strange voice. And so there's a lot of overlap. And then so suddenly when you're on psychedelics, you can start to see your actual neighbor next door as a witch. And you're like, holy crap, old lady Jane next door looks like a witch right now. What is going on? And that can manifest while on psychedelics because the concepts, the energy that you are paying to differentiate those ideas stops getting differentiated. So now they were all the way over here, but now they're drifting back towards center. So good and bad can start drifting back towards center. Hot and cold can start drifting back towards center. Those might be a little bit more fundamental beliefs or fundamental concepts that might maintain their separation more broadly than the neighbor next door and a witch, for example. But regardless, concepts that could overlap do start to overlap when you stop the energy flow in certain areas of the brain. Well, that's pretty weird. And so then through the work with Jack Kaczynski and our development of some of these ideas, his work showed that the energy is what matters in the brain here. And so that's where there was a big breakthrough for me, and a big aha hit where I was like, oh, it's about the energy pumping and the interference. And so when you are, because when you basically, let's just assume that like all of the energy is being used by the default mode network. And if all of the energy is being used over here, then over here doesn't have enough energy. So I don't know if any of you have seen Star Wars. In Star Wars Episode 1, Anakin is pod racing, and then one of his boosters gets shot out. And so then he has to redistribute energy, half of the energy over here to refire the booster over here. So he basically has to distribute the energy to a different place. And so you could think about the same thing happening in the brain when you take, when the default mode network is quiet. So think about that. When you don't have the self-referential thinking, when you're not thinking about yourself, when you're not meaning making, when you're not differentiating things, when you're not judging things, when you're not organizing things between categories, when you're not categorizing things, that quiets the default mode network. And then that energy that would have been used to be doing all of those processes can now distribute to other parts of the brain. And that's the hypothesis here, is that now, when that quiets, that enables more energy to be used on the quantum side, which allows for longer quantum states in the brain, more quantum states in the brain, and that enables you to feel like this, you're exploring all these possibilities at once, these patterns emerge, you can act without thinking. And so these flow states and these sense of aliveness that you can feel in the process of creating or acting or being at your best would be this parallel processing happening in real time. There's obviously a difference between classical behaviors, which would be like habits or bad habits. Like any normal behavior that feels automatic doesn't just mean that you're just in quantum mode right now. But what that could do is that, like, for example, when you wash the dishes, like, okay, you've washed the dishes a million times. It's not like that is a quantum process per se, but what may be happening is that when you wash the dishes, it actually frees up your mind potentially to stop thinking about yourself for a second. So, now the process is happening over here, and then suddenly maybe that reduces your self-referential thinking. And then in that moment, you have brilliant ideas. You have the best ideas you've ever had. And this could be the same thing with like shower thoughts, or thoughts before bed or after waking up, or, thoughts while driving potentially, or thoughts while, like while cooking or doing the dishes. These are things that just do enough to reduce for your brain to get distracted, AKA for you to stop thinking about yourself. And then that allows for that energy to redistribute, and then for your brain to explore possibilities. And in that moment, you have an aha, you have an insight, you have something that just seemed to appear to you in that moment. And those are quantum processes. Those are the insights, the ahas, the flow states that emerge from self-referential thinking. So then wrapping it all the way back to the performance paradox, you have to ask, okay, so considering that in performance, then what is the key? The key is to reduce self-referential thinking, which means you have to reduce measurement, observation, differentiation, tracking progress in performance. Like maybe in practice, because again, like you in these weird games that us humans have invented, like golf or basketball, like you don't learn those things in day-to-day operations. Your body is still a body. It does still use neurons, but the difference is that the brain doesn't necessarily need the neurons per se in the same way that the muscles and the whole body need the brain. To shoot a basketball, to swing a golf club, are physical processes that require a lot of practice. Same thing with playing a concert piano piece, or even practicing instruments. Like those are biological. If you're playing the trombone or like a piano, those are very biological movements. And so physiological movements. And so you have to learn those movements over time And that does take time to practice. Same thing with basketball or golf or football or soccer or tennis or whatever, any physical thing. And like even in video games, because at the end of the day, your brain does make predictions. It is sort of like an LLM. Like you have to have training data to learn about different domains. And then in those domains, you become better at making predictions about what's going to happen next. But at the same time, yes, those things are real and they matter in a classical perspective. But then the idea would be is that when you reduce the self-referential thinking, this is why any athlete, when they're at their best in a game, they know they're not thinking about themselves. They're not thinking about how they shoot the basketball in the final seconds of the biggest game when they're making every shot that they take. It's because they're not thinking about it. I mean, Tiger Woods literally said in interviews that to him, a golf shot at the Masters and a golf shot at the driving range were the exact same. There was no difference to him. And I always thought that was absolute BS. Like, there's just no way, you know? But the reality is that over time, he had learned to reduce the meaning of performance, to practice the same way he played and played the same way he practiced. And that meant also what it means to you. The paradox is that you can't let tournaments mean more to you. And that is a paradoxical statement itself by saying you can't let. But the difference here is that you have to fall in love with the process itself. You have to fall in love with the golf swing itself, with the three-pointer itself, with the game of basketball itself, and then take on the processes of those actions and then embody them fully as present as you can be. And you have to entirely let go of the result itself. And you can't measure your progress. You can't say, wow, I'm on pace for X. I'm doing X. I'm about to be as good as X. I'm better than I've ever been. I'm behind. I'm ahead. I'm above. I'm below. These are all measurements. And those things reduce what can manifest from your practice. Because in your practice, you were actually practicing in a different context, in a different meaning structure than you were in your performance. Then in your performance, now if you're performing and you have all this meaning and all this anxiety and worry and what does this mean about my legacy and yada, 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 that clearly is going to affect what can manifest in that moment from your practice. It's going to be different. So all of those things are part of this bigger idea. And obviously this is just the performance side of things, but what does this have to say about learning, about human behavior, about raising a family, about how we live our lives, what life means in general? Because if you can dissect meaning all the way down to your ego differentiating words, well then what does meaning really mean? And those are all the things that we kind of explore in other parts of the book and whatnot. But I wanted to leave you with that paradox for now, because there is something strange about how our internal judgment changes the performance, changes what we can do in the pressure situations, and how that affected my life, my entire life, and how that's beginning to change now. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for hanging with me, and I'll talk to you very soon. See ya.